Ducklings, darlings, I am taking a break from packing for my upcoming trip to Latvia to film my quarterly book report to you all. My goal is to get it filmed and edited before I leave. We'll see if that happens. Once again, and as always, I am using my Storygraph tracking to take you through everything that I've read and to give you my thoughts of what I enjoyed this past quarter. And I really liked doing a deep dive into a single book a few weeks ago when we did an unofficial book club on the wildly popular and wildly controversial book Yesteryear. So if any of these books interest you based on what I say, drop me a comment and let me know if you want to do one of those again. If you want to do like a decadent book club meetup or deep dive into any one of these or even into a genre, because preview of next quarter, but oh my goodness, I am getting sucked into a particular series that has taken over my brain and personality, but also reminds me so much of other not similar, but similar vibey kind of books that I've adored in the past. And so, oh God, I can't talk about it yet. I gotta be good. I gotta be good. This is April through June reading, and I'm already teasing you about what I'm reading now in July. So nope, staying on target, stay on target. Some updates for this month. I will link as many of the books as I can find on bookstore.org, which is an independent conglomeration of booksellers. If you want alternatives to large unnamed corporations, this is a good outfit from whom to purchase your books. If you live in the UK, as I do, they have a UK specific store as well. Same rules apply. If you're going to buy any books, please consider buying from independent bookstores, secondhand, or even direct from authors. As a someday aspiring author myself, but also like the best friend of many published authors, it ain't easy out there. So if you love books, if you love the people who write them, support them directly whenever possible. And with that lengthy and spicy preamble, what did I read in Q2 of 2026? So I continued the Wraith King series by Grace Draven. This is a fantasy series. As I've mentioned before, I used to read a lot of fantasy, but I've kind of fallen off in recent years, and so I'm trying to get back in the swing of things. Both of my brothers are huge fantasy readers. One of my good friends, Chris, is a massive fantasy reader. I constantly am inundated with really good recommendations from cool and interesting people, and I need to do better. But this has been a great series to jump back into. It's not, the grand epics of Tolkien, George R.R. Martin, or even, Saunders, but this is a really well constructed world of different kinds of races and creatures and people that is a good example of world building to me. I really like how Draven creates and crafts the rules of her world, which is of course what any good fantasy series kind of lives or dies by. I've read, let me just scroll here real quick, 5 books. A combination of novels, novellas, and short stories that she has built in this world. As always, I'm sure I've already been doing this, but you can see the covers and titles on the screen. I'm really enjoying it. I've got a few more of her books that apparently are set in the same universe to get through. So I'm on the wait list in the library for those, but I'm enjoying those. If you want an easy kind of fantasy series, maybe to whet your teeth on it. Whet your teeth? I am mixing metaphors. Cut your teeth or whet your appetite. Whew. I've enjoyed this one. Next up, first in nonfiction this month, I read Plutocrats, The Rise of the New Global Super Rich and the Fall of Everyone Else. I joke all the time that I tend to read in themes, and you as always, you'll notice a few thematic reads this quarter. This was a really fascinating book for me to read because As I've referred to before, I have some experience professionally in the world of high net worth individuals. It's been years since I've worked adjacent to that kind of world, but it was a formative experience for me. And I have long been fascinated with inequality. I'll come back to this very shortly, I promise. But the thing that I think this book was so fascinating for me to read now was that it was originally published in 2012. And a lot has happened in the world of wealth, globally speaking, since then. Most of the richest people in the world, the top 1% of the 1%, have exponentially grown their wealth. If you look at the, the reputable financial reporting on this, it's a little bit scary how different the world is from when this book was written to now when I'm reading it, and what it was describing then in terms of the habits, the purchasing power, and the social political influence and capital that has been consolidated in the ultra wealthy, particularly in the democratic West, but not exclusively, and how as a cohort, as a demographic, that group of people is choosing to deploy that capital in the modern age. Again, written in 2012, was scary then, and I think is probably scarier now. Next up, I read, or rather listened to by audiobook, which I recommend, Care to Make Love in That Gross Little Space Between Cars, a Believer Book of Advice. Weird title, but what this is The Believer is a magazine, a literary magazine. And this particular book is a collection, a compendium of advice pieces written and performed by actors, writers, producers, creatives of all types. And the audiobook version features a different narrator for each of the pieces included, which was really, really fun. It's also deeply, deeply unserious. The kind of advice they're getting is like how to get rid of hermit crabs as told by a comedian. So like, it's not, you don't need to take it too seriously, but if you want some fun and punchy narration, maybe on a walk or a car ride or something like that, this was fun. I've definitely read better, shorter pieces and essays and short stories, I'd think, but I enjoyed it. Next up, the latest in Richard Osman's Thursday Murder Club series. I read The Impossible Fortune, which is the 5th in the series. I enjoy this series. It's a lot of fun. I love murder mysteries, and I like Richard Osman's take. He writes an absolutely fun cast of characters, and an unusual cast of characters. Like we have the lone elderly detective, the Miss Marples of the world. But what I like about this series is that it is a group of old age pensioners, retirees, who live in a community together and solve murders together with the help, of course, of their neighbors, their friends, and a local policewoman who's a total character in her own right. I don't know that this was my favorite in the series, but I enjoy the series as a whole tremendously. And I did not at all enjoy the Netflix adaptation, which is too bad because Dame Helen Mirren, Sir Ben Kingsley, with the cast that they had with this thing, Pierce Brosnan, there was no excuse for it to have been as bad as it was, but it was bad. And that makes me sad. You'll see Flo walking around in the background. Next, another rough one. I read When the Clock Broke, Conman, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. I joke all the time that you should not follow me on my Instagram stories, and you shouldn't because it's just stream of consciousness. But something that I spend a lot of time thinking and talking about are the individual movers and shakers and forces in American, especially, but not exclusively, media and public life, and how specific characters and individuals have shaped the world that I came of age in and became an adult in. And the early 90s, I remember that time period. For my audience, they probably have a very different experience. I was a very young child at that time, but I remember the 90s. I remember moving from Germany to Texas. That was the big move of that period of my life, which, as you can imagine, was a major culture change. I remember the Clinton presidency. I remember a lot of the big news moments of that period, like surprisingly well, I would say. I remember the culture as it was shaping, of course, now seen through the lens of adult eyes. This book goes through specific trends in the American religious system, in the American media landscape, and yes, in the American political landscape, and crucially, where those worlds intersect. So to detail how matching and looping trends in those spaces produced similar and composite effects that permanently altered the course of American politics and culture. John Ganz is a well-known political writer, and I think what he crystallizes is like the weird sense of discontentment that existed in this period of America, which was odd. The Cold War had just ended, and a lot of threats that the US felt it had been facing kind of melted away. And instead of breathing a sigh of relief, a lot of people seemed to be determined to find the next crisis to freak out about. And the rise of militia, the rise of conspiracism, the rise of crank shock jocks, insurgent populist bids, particular characters in the weird mishmash of American media, pop culture, and politics, like David Duke, Klansman, Ross Perot, Newt Gingrich, Rush Limbaugh, a lot of people that had an impact on American politics and culture for decades rose to prominence in this period. And this book really details how and why a few of those key figures did so, what their trajectories were, what their paths were, and why they were able to take those paths when they did at that moment in American history. If you're at all interested in the current age of American politics, I think this is an interesting book to consider reading to understand the background, because as always, nothing springs from out of nowhere, right? You have to know how we got here to really understand the moment. And I think this is a really good book for understanding some of the foundations laid 30 years ago now that have produced American politics as it is now exerting itself on the world stage. So, recommended. I enjoyed this. Next up, I keep joking that I'm behind on my reading goals for this year, because I am. I'm still not where I usually am in terms of sheer numbers for this time of year, but This one I'm going to say gives me a good reason for it, because I read Capital and Ideology by Thomas Piketty, and this thing is a tome. Piketty is a French economist and sociologist and a social economist, I think is the best way to describe him. He has written several best-selling and very, very massive, chunky books on capitalism in the 21st century, I think is the book that he's most known for. I'm still on the wait list at the library for that. But this one, Capital and Ideology, was a fascinating read. And interestingly, in reading up on a bit more on it after I finished it, apparently Piketty himself likes this book more than his more famous Capitalism in the 21st Century. That's because Piketty is a social economist, and what he's really interested in is the politics and sociology of inequality and how systems create themselves and then sustain themselves to create, but in a non-pejorative sense, to create and manage and de-risk inequality in any given political system. Piketty views inequality not as like a result necessarily of market forces, but as an outcome of ideology, i.e., your beliefs construct your actions, and your actions construct the systems that we all have to live in. And different beliefs about the world and how it is shaped and how it should be shaped determine the kinds of inequalities that you get. And I find that philosophical treatment of economics to be deeply interesting and compelling. I am interested in why things are the way they are, what the capacity is within human nature and systems for change, and why change often doesn't happen even when we largely can express some discontent with what we're dealing with, all of which is deeply relevant to this book. Piketty is an equal opportunity offender. He looks at European systems, he looks at international systems, he looks at American systems. He is critical of capitalism while also, I think, correctly diagnosing that for better or worse, it's the system that most of the world lives in and has lived in now for centuries and is not likely to change. Not that he thinks it shouldn't change, but that the ideologies that have built governments and markets and trade agreements and any number of things make structural changes to our systems very, very difficult. He does produce a number of recommendations for how he thinks things should be done differently. Weirdly, I find these elements the weakest part of the book. Not because I disagree with his perspectives. In fact, I agree with many of his stated goals and intentions. But I was more interested in this book as an explanation of, again, how taking data, taking history, taking a very, very empirical look at how inequality is created in human society, and then how it sustains itself or perpetuates itself. And as I said, what the risks are when the balance, the tension that inequality produces gets too risky for that system to continue to bear. Another thing that I really like is because he's also a historian, he looks at alternates that have existed in history within the West, within France, within international systems, all over, and points out that the version of capitalism we have now has not been consistent from the jump. And, he goes all the way back to Adam Smith and John Locke and the ideologies, the philosophies, particularly from the 18th century, that have produced the kind of capitalism we have now, as opposed to mercantilism or earlier versions of feudalistic trade. He points out that our approach and our cultural relationships to trade and to capital, i.e. assets, the accumulation and use of wealth, have varied dramatically over the 7,000 years of recorded human history that we have. And he brings the receipts for the arguments that he makes. If anything, like if I had a philosophical critique of his work, it's that he claims a somewhat radical view of how bad inequality is, how dangerous inequality is, and how dangerous we have allowed inequality to become politically in the 21st century. And he makes recommendations or suggestions of how to correct it, but they seem very, very gentle and cerebral and academic, as opposed to practical. Given the rest of his book and kind of the detail that he goes into, I think he himself also makes the argument that you can't always rationalize your way out of belief, that it's belief that structures a lot of human behaviors and society, and belief is not always rational. So you cannot always counter arguments of belief with arguments of rationality, as much as we all wish that we could. So I think that's why some of his proposal language just doesn't quite work for me, because it doesn't seem to match with what the other arguments that I think he makes very successfully in the same book. This took me a while to get through. This, as I said, it's over 1,000 pages. And for all of that, it is a very, very accessible book. I think Piketty does a really good job of taking very large ideas, big concepts, broad history, and conveying it in very, very accessible language. You do not have to be an economist. You do not have to be a historian. You do not have to be a philosopher to follow the narratives that he lays out, to understand the claims that he makes and to evaluate them. And that alone is a real compliment in my book of quality academic writing. Next up, I read Andrew Ross Sorkin's 1929, Inside the Greatest Crash in Wall Street History and How It Shattered a Nation. This one was okay. This is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a social history of the lead up to the Great Depression, or the crash that kicked off the Great Depression. I found it a surprisingly boring read. The thesis that Sorkin is making is that, we're living in a very parallel time, so understanding what happened then is important to understanding what's happening now. I don't think he's necessarily wrong in that, but I found this book surprisingly dull. And I'm saying that after saying I read a 1,000+ page book on history and economics. So it's not that I don't have the attention span for this sort of thing. I don't know. The writing for this, it seemed to use a lot of words to not convey a lot of new information to me, is the only way I can describe it. It was perfectly fine. It was a fine read, but I wouldn't say that it was a good one. Next up in my medievalism world, I read Dan Jones' Henry V, The Astonishing Rise of England's Greatest Warrior King. Dan Jones, popular medieval historian, written many books, including fiction of the medieval period. Exactly as he says, a biography of Henry V. Henry V looms large in the British and especially English imagination. Of course, Shakespeare, immortalized him in so many ways. But Dan Jones really, really looks up to and admires many aspects of what Henry V was able to do. Most people only think of Henry V in relation to, the Battle of Agincourt. But Dan Jones starts with his birth and his early life, and gives a lot of biographical detail, which is harder to come by without good, academic research, into what shaped the life of this man, allowed him to be an active warrior king in a very dangerous age, and how he set up and managed the administrative state that allowed him to pursue his wars and his goals in France. If you like medieval history, number one, you're on the right channel. And number two, this is a good example, I would say, of popular medieval history that is worth your time. And now for something completely different. The next biography I read was by Michael Steinberger, and it was The Philosopher in the Valley, Alex Karp, Palantir, and the Rise of the Surveillance State. If you look back at my previous book reports, I'm very interested in technology and the history of technology and the personalities driving the current age of technology and business on the world stage. Alex Karp is one of those people. I've been aware of him for a long time, but given the prominence that Palantir, the company that he is a CEO of, has over the world, over both American and increasingly British politics, and the potential for future incursions and influence by this company into both, I thought I needed to crack open a biography to understand the man himself better. And he's a weird one, man. Like so many of the people who seem to rise to prominence in Silicon Valley, he is an odd person. He has a odd mix of compelling drives. He has a very, very carefully crafted and even protected backstory. He is famous, weirdly, for keeping huge parts of his life highly, highly compartmentalized and personal. So he's kind of a mysterious figure, and for that, like a book like this, which actually goes into biographical detail, I thought was really, really useful to me to understand. You've probably seen this man, in my opinion, very likely high on drugs on any number of news interviews of late. Like so many other people in Silicon Valley, he seems to also have gotten high on his own supply, all jokes intended, in terms of watching his power and clout and influence rise, and thereby determining that he must therefore be a great man of history. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is it wealth and prominence, begets power and influence, or must you be a great man in order to accumulate the latter? A lot of Silicon Valley people fall into the second camp and are very, very uncomfortable with the realities of other beliefs that it fosters in them. I've ranted about this elsewhere. I think I did this in my last book report or one earlier in the year, but a lot of prominent people in Silicon Valley hold a lot of very, very uncomfortable and I would say dangerous views to me that I would not hesitate to place alongside discussions of eugenics. And the idea that the best people rise to positions of power and prominence And because these kinds of Silicon Valley leaders, find themselves in those positions of prominence, ergo, they must be some of the best people. And therefore, they must be in charge of huge decisions. They must be able to influence the world and governments and societies because obviously they know better. This book details one man who thinks that way and also what might have shaped him to influence him to end up that way, and why the company he heads needs to be viewed through a critical lens, because not just of the power and the influence that it wields, how it has been able to amass its business platform, but the philosophies and the beliefs steering its actions at the very top. Next up, I decided to continue to hurt my own feelings by reading Laura Bates' latest, The New Age of Sexism. Laura Bates has written before very, very well, and with some really, really strong reportage and journalism instincts and backgrounds and approaches on online misogyny, how it's crafted, the communities that pursue it, why they do so, how it looks, and how the unique age of the internet has fostered certain behaviors, certain individuals and personalities, and even certain movements that have real social and political power, weaponizing gender, specifically tracking how male culture has adapted and changed over the years through the use of the internet to adopt or perform misogyny in new ways. This book is very much a follow-on to previous writings that she's done for that reason. It's kind of horrifying. Very much in the same vein, it's reportage style, interview-based, investigative-based exploration of how technology is developing in this new internet age, up to and including the age of AI, and how certain aspects of misogyny have been coded into the design of our technologies. Now, that is a statement that might make some people uncomfortable. It might get your hackles up. I understand that, and I appreciate why that may be, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong. Famously, Facebook started as a hot or not website where people could rank the physical beauty of women, and now it is the most powerful media platform in the world. And this book traces how certain ideas at the outset, if you don't consider the biases that you bring into something, which we all carry, every human being carries, but when you don't intentionally think about or counteract some of those biases, it shows up in the technology as it develops. I don't think it's too much of a jump then to say that, that there are aspects of gender blindness at the best and misogyny at worst coded into new aspects of technology that we're dealing with right now. At time of recording, there's something of a media kerfuffle around, once again, Facebook, i.e. Meta. They rebranded themselves because they were going to invent the metaverse. Remember that? And they spent billions on it and crashed and burned. I do. But something that Meta is trying to make happen is Meta glasses. The idea being that there's a wearable interface that can allow people to use AI and their platforms and data and what have you in new and interesting ways to navigate through the world. And one of the discussions that's coming to the fore about this is how unsafe something like Meta glasses are for women and girls in particular, because of how people are already using technologies like AI and search or what have you for specifically gendered kinds of abuse, stalking, and violence. On a previous rant, I talked about how just at the start of this year, Grok, the AI associated with Twitter/X, was in its own media storm because of lack of security and lack of programming protections, made it so that people were using Grok to produce huge amounts of sexual abuse imagery, including child sex abuse imagery. And again, using AI to manufacture this. In some cases, it was creating deep fake images of real people, and in some cases, it was just generating new content when prompted to do so. But because of how AI works, it's pulling from actual existing horrific imagery in order to build a kind of composite version of that. A person moving through the world with tech like this could potentially, and we are already starting to see examples of this, use it in unique ways that a lot of, bluntly speaking, men might not consider the way that women would. I have no problem saying that as a woman, I probably move physically through spaces in the world in a different way than, say, my husband, who is a fantastic partner and an absolutely fantastic feminist man. But I think even he would be the first to admit that his lived experience of certain spaces is very different than mine. The fears he has of moving at certain spaces at certain times of day or night, the considerations he has to bring when it comes to personal or professional safety are not less than, but are different from the ones that I experience. And he would be the first to admit that as a woman, I live with a kind of overarching threat of sexual violence that he doesn't in the same way. Technology is a tool. Technology in and of itself is neutral. But this book points out that technologies are not built in vacuums. They're built by people, and people bring our preferences and our blindnesses to the things that we develop. And this book is a really fascinating and frankly depressing book about how blindnesses around gendered experiences, particularly those for women and girls, are allowing us to create or perpetuate technologies that then in turn can be used to hurt women and girls in unique ways. This isn't a fun read, but it is a pertinent one. And if you have or have in your life young women whomst you care about, this is a good book to read to understand the technological aspects of the world that they are living in that are fundamentally different than what you might have experienced growing up yourself. Another book that I read, I said I wanted to read more horror, and I read Nothing But Blackened Teeth by Cassandra Khaw. This is Japanese folklore-inspired based horror. As with many things horror, I don't feel like I can go too much into it without revealing it, but it is wonderfully creepily written, and I really enjoyed it, and I'm going to continue in this horror thread for myself. The next book I read was The Girl Bandits of the Warsaw Ghetto, The True Story of 5 Courageous Young Women by Elizabeth R. Hyman. Again, this is a history. It is about particularly women in Poland, in the Warsaw Ghetto, who were part of resistance movements of the Jewish community that mobilized to protest, to fight against, and to undermine the occupation and the brutalization of their community. It was really, really powerful. Again, in my last update, I think I talked about The Dressmakers of Auschwitz being another book that I read about women surviving the Holocaust. This is another version of that, but this is women surviving boots on the ground in a war zone. It was really, really powerful. I enjoyed this one a lot. More fiction, because again, I said I wanted to do better about reading more fiction. I read Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunders, and God, this book, golly, how do I describe it? This is a book about grief. This is a book about grief and what lingers after death and loss. It's set in the midst of the Civil War, and it details specifically Abraham Lincoln's young son who died as a young boy, and whose death had really deep impact on both Abraham Lincoln and his wife Mary Todd Lincoln in ways that lasted the rest of their lives. The idea is kind of a weird take on purgatory, and once Lincoln's son Willie dies, he finds himself in this afterlife with all of these other people who are also stuck in this afterlife together. Oh golly, there's this sprawling cast of characters, and again, I listened to this in audiobook form, which was recommended to me because the audiobook that I listened to was quite literally a production with multiple narrators for the different characters. And that was such a cool listening experience. In many ways, it felt like I was listening to a radio play performance of this book. So again, some books I think you have to physically read. Other books I think you can have a really different and unique experience depending on how they're produced. This one is the latter. If you are interested in this book, if you've heard about it, know that it's big and it's bold and it has, complicated ideas. But the audiobook production might be the way to go for this one. I highly, highly recommend it. Then back to back, I read Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism by Angus Deaton and Anne Case. That's what it says on the tin. This is a book that traces different kinds of behaviors as social demographic groups. And the goal is to kind of explain why life expectancy in the United States has gone down, what is driving that relative to national, broadly speaking, wealth and success and production. I think there's greater awareness of the term deaths of despair, that is a basket of categories that generally means that your material, social, psychological circumstances have deteriorated in a way that materially affects someone's mental health, physical health, and longevity. These could include deaths by suicide. These could include deaths compounded through medical debt. These could be lack of access to care or lack of access to even insurance, which is a whole separate thing in the United States. Basically, why the working class lives have gotten harder and shorter disproportionately in relation to GDP. Again, not a fun read, but one based in economics, in history, and a huge amount of research and investigative journalism. Followed immediately by The Big Myth, How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market. I'm not subtle about my choices, am I? This is, again, don't be fooled by the title. This is a book of history and social history. It goes into detail about how in the 20th century in particular, certain individuals, movements, vested interest groups took specific coordinated actions, well-documented actions to influence the culture, the behaviors, the professional habits of Americans, all in such a way to cultivate a distrust of government and contribute to the idea that the free market solves everything. Your personal philosophy response to that may vary. Going back to something I was ranting about earlier, I am very critical of the systems that we live in while acknowledging that they're the systems that we live in. And we've gotten to them for reasons. I might not always like the system that I live in, but I have an obligation to learn how it works, how to best navigate it, and, I feel how all of the myriad ways that might be available to me to change it if I don't like it. This starts the early 20th century, it goes up through the 1990s with particular focus on the 1970s. And again, how trade associations, prominent businessmen, specific political parties or think tanks or groups with an agenda, with a specific libertarian agenda that was anti-government, set about proselytizing their ideas and the means and the campaigns that they undertook to do so. Again, I keep saying this, if you want to understand a huge portion of American politics today, you must go further back. You must have to take a long-term historic view of it because it did not arise from nowhere. And it has been, in my opinion, many, many decades in the making. This is a really good example of taking that long view. Again, starting in the late 19th century, all the way up to the response to the COVID pandemic. If you want to understand aspects of American culture right now, this might be an interesting one. Then two works of fiction. I read Half His Age by Jeanette McCurdy. She wrote the personal memoir that got very popular a couple of years ago, I'm Glad My Mom Died, which on the title alone caused quite a stir. This is her first work of fiction. It's about a woman, a student, a child, who undertakes an inappropriate relationship with a teacher, and why and how, and the impacts and what it brings about, and why she might have wanted to do that. It is a complicated book. It is not a comfortable book, but it is a competent book. I'm curious to see what Jennette McCurdy does in the world of fiction in the future, because this is a hell of a topic to take on for your first work of fiction. And while I have some criticisms of it as a novel, I also think it's a pretty impressive debut for a lot of reasons. So I'm curious to see what she writes next. In a similar vein, and I will link my video here somewhere, I did a whole video about this, Yesteryear by Caro Claire Burke. I've spent an hour talking about this. I won't bore you further, but yeah, this was an interesting one. Click here to view more. Next up, I read Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. There is a PR narrative that America is a nation of immigrants, and on one level it's true, we are. And on another level, we have always been an anti-immigrant nation. And this book traces the history of America from our earliest settled period, from the 16th century, or 17th century, excuse me, up until today. Which immigrants were good immigrants? Which immigrants were bad immigrants? I referenced, some of my personal history and culture in a video I did a couple of weeks ago for July 4th. But the idea that there has ever been a particular past golden age in American history is a fallacy. And that there was ever a period where we were welcoming to immigrants is also a lie. It just is. This has always been a source of contention. Because we were a settler colonial nation that colonized and extracted land from other people, because we were not native to the country that became the United States. Everyone from there, with the exception of the indigenous populations, came from somewhere else. Crafting and maintaining a cultural and national identity is harder and different for Americans when you don't have a shared ethnic background. And this book goes into the history of different groups of people and how they were and were not included or excluded from the American project as it moved westward in fits and starts, as it moved forward in history, as it changed its own self-narrative about who it was as a nation and who could be included in its project. Not a fun read, but again, a really interesting one. Then I read How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Immerwahr. I'm mispronouncing that. Immerwahr? I'm so sorry. This was fascinating because, again, more American history, but through a different lens, through the lens of imperialist thinking and behaviors. The author makes the case that the United States, until fairly recently, was very, very comfortable referring to itself as, acting as, behaving as an empire alongside other perceived great empires of the world. The way that it talked about, for instance, we use the word territories now. They didn't used to. They used to be called colonies. And the relationship the United States has had to areas that were later and currently are encompassed in its own borders has never been uncomplicated. And I know this, having been born and then later living in American territories myself. The relationship that you have to the motherland or the nation state is very different in different parts of the country and in different categories of national states. Immerwahr goes into how this manifested in fascinating ways. So, for example, the attack on Pearl Harbor was not just an attack on Hawaii. It was a series of coordinated attacks across, military outposts throughout the Pacific. But the only one that really got the playtime and the airtime that it did, and has become, of course, the day that will live in infamy, is the one that happened on an American state's soil. even though other attacks elsewhere in the Pacific were far more physically impactful. And, you know, he explains why, how a state carried different weight and has, the Americans have different relationships or a different sense of responsibility to that than it did to, say, Guam, where I was born. He goes into how different areas of the United States have had their territories and resources extracted in different ways. What kinds of tools of democracy have or have not been available to the people living in them. How territory was claimed, was fought over in various wars, and was then brought into or incorporated or not incorporated into the wider American system and project. Basically, this is a book about how if you think of a cardboard cutout of the United States, you think you know of the shape, right? You know where Texas is, and you know that Florida is a little bit hanging off. You know California's on the other side. The point of this book is that there's a constellation of other islands, territories, states in some cases, that don't fit into that very recognizable shape, and that the ones that don't fit into it have a very different experience of the country than the rest of it. And I found that very, very interesting. Guys, I said that, you know, I'm interested in doing book club stuff in the future. This is one of the most fun pieces of fiction I have read in a long time. There Is No Antimemetics Division by Quantum. Quantum is the pen name of the author, so it's the name I'm going to use, even though you can actually Google this. This book is so hard to explain because of its premise. It is such a clever piece of science and speculative fiction. It's a little bit like the video game Claire Obscure Expedition 33. And it's a little bit like Jasper Ford's Thursday Next book series. It's a little bit Douglas Adams, but it's also a little bit Lovecraft. It's just so good. It's so good. So the clue is in the title. There is no anti-memetics division. And it takes the idea that there are memes. When you hear the word meme, you probably think of like internet culture, right? You think of an image that is used to react to something. But what a meme is, like philosophically speaking, what a meme is it is a shorthand, usually but not always, visual way to explain a very big idea very, very succinctly. And quite often when we use, say, a reaction meme in response to a news story, we are trying to convey an entire basket of emotional reactions to a headline or to an action or to, we're reacting to something. And it's not just happy or sad. Depending on the image you might use to react to something, you're trying to convey like, oh, this makes me deeply uncomfortable, but I can't look away, which is a more complex thought than just haha, that's funny, right? So that's what a meme is. A meme is a shorthand way to convey a big idea. And the concept of this book is that memes exist. Memes are a shared language, a shared belief, a shared basket of assumptions about any number of things, ideas, concepts, creatures. Again, ideas, like that ideas can be physically real in ways that it's kind of hard to describe. Like I said, this is science fiction, this is speculative fiction, but if there are memes that exist, concepts that have been brought into reality through shared collective knowledge and understanding of them, an anti-meme is something that exists that counteracts that, is an idea that self-censors, that you can't share, that can't be shared with anyone else. It's an anti-idea. And there's a whole department dedicated to them because these anti-ideas can wreak havoc in the world. And how do you, if a meme is something you don't have to explain because enough people understand it, and an anti-meme is something you can't explain because it rejects shared understanding, how do you fight an idea or a concept or a being that you are unable to explain to anyone else? again, I can't talk about this book in any great detail without completely undermining or unraveling the premise. But if you like science fiction, if you like speculative fiction, this was such a good book. And indeed, there are some other books in my brain, even some that I've referenced in this ramble, that it really reminds me of in a fun way that I'd love to dive into. Let me know if you're interested. We're nearly done, I promise. The next thing I read was another piece of horror called Those Across the River by Christopher Brillman. This was great because this was a Southern Gothic story, but between Interview with the Vampire and other kind of vibes, I feel like vampires have kind of had a lock on Southern Gothic between maybe associations with New Orleans and, you know, pop culture understandings of voodoo, or just that kind of creepy decay of the Southern Gothic aesthetic. But this is not a vampire story. It's closer to a werewolf story, and I liked it. I had fun. This was a fun horror read, and I heartily recommend it. Moving fast, moving on, I read some more George Saunders. I read Liberation Day, which is his collection of short stories, most of which are science or speculative fiction again. Each story is standalone, is unique, is almost like an episode of Black Mirror, but not always as bleak, but kind of that vibe of some things. Really enjoyed. I read two books back to back, which were really interesting. One was Youth Juice by E.K. Sethu, which is a fiction horror book, but is based on beauty culture and is so clearly drawing on the business experience of the beauty brand Glossier, which is a company that has had a very genuinely interesting business story. I will put on the screen somewhere else a link to a nonfiction book that I read, I think earlier in the year, about this, or maybe last year, about this company. But again, this is fiction. This is horror. But it takes that story of that business very clearly and draws from it and turns the idea of the pursuit of youth and beauty and what it does to people, and turns that into a fantastic female-coded horror story. I enjoyed. Weirdly, immediately after that, I read Pixel Flesh, How Toxic Beauty Culture Harms Women by Ellen Atlanta. This is a nonfiction book, and reading these back to back was really interesting because the title is exactly, the title is what this book is. It is an exploration of beauty culture, the aesthetics, the businesses, the expectations, the cultural practices around female beauty, what the expectations are for women, and how those can and often do harm women. So from horror to nonfiction back to back, very interesting. Then the last nonfiction book I read was a memoir. It was Strangers, a Memoir of Marriage by Belle Burden. This is another one like Yesteryear that was everywhere. Like everyone was reading it, everyone was recommending it, and I thought it was an interesting read. The premise is that a very privileged and wealthy woman is living her life when suddenly her husband tells her he doesn't want to be married to her anymore, and you know, there's that. But more critically, the financial impacts of that on this woman who comes from old money in the United States, in her telling, did not see this coming and had made a series of choices over the years to passively allow her husband to drive the finances of the family, and the impact of that change on her. I think this is more of a memoir about money than it is about marriage, but the narrative has since been complicated because the response to this book was so overwhelming that actually it prompted other reporters to look into it. Belle Burden initially wrote a Modern Love column, which is a very famous column series from the New York Times, which just contains people telling individual love stories of love and heartbreak from a personal perspective. That column, when it came out, it got a great deal of attention and praise, which then led to the book deal that produced this. But in response then, the New Yorker actually looked into a lot of her claims, and let's just say that truths might be stranger than memoir nonfiction sometimes. The narrative that the book puts forward, it may not be the whole story. And yet for all of that, it is a well-written book. Belle Burden is a good writer. And there's a lot of passages and perspectives in this that I think are fascinating. So I recommend it being read, but I have to recommend that you also read the journalism that accompanies this. And finally, the last book I read in June was Wise Guys by Nicholas Pileggi. I am so sorry. Life in a Mafia Family. This is the book that the film Goodfellas was based off of. Written in 1985, so before I was born. It's biography, it's nonfiction. It gives the portrayal of, again, what the subtitle says, life in a mafia family in the 1980s. How it worked, what the relationships were like, how organized crime function, what the relationships, the family ties, the social ties were, how men rose and fell in the ranks, and through the lens of one man's personal experience. For all of that, it was an interesting read just to get, a first-hand account of organized crime. It was very well written biography. And the story is fascinating, even if the subject matter was, a little bit weird. I've talked for so long now that I can't do it in good conscience, but rest assured, kittens, Aunt C Smut Corner is alive and well. I read a lot of filth this past quarter. I'll put all of the titles and stuff on the screen, but I will, as always, shout out some of the best things that I read or the ones that I would recommend because, as we know, not all smut is created equal. As always, I really like Ali Hazelwood. She had a novella that I read called Two Can Play. It takes place in the professional game design universe, which was very sweet. Ali Hazelwood also spearheaded a project to do a collection of dystopian romance novellas. She and several of her author friends all contributed different pieces to the project, which was called After the End, and I read volumes 1 and 2, so a collection of standalone stories that I really enjoyed. I don't want to give her all of the credit, so some other authors included in that are Claire Kent, Elizabeth Stevens, Kate C. Wells, lots and lots of people, but to the best of my knowledge, it was spearheaded by Ali Hazelwood. As always, I will link my story reads account below. I hide nothing. You can see everything that I read. I document everything and I rate everything. So there are no secrets here, children. I would say, broadly speaking, as a quarter, I made a real effort to read less genre fiction. So again, I only read one murder mystery and I read less romance than I typically do because I was trying really hard to read other kinds of genre fiction, fantasy, science fiction, horror. And there was one really, really meaty book in there on history and economics. So thank you, as always, for bearing with. That is my Q2 reading list. Please tell me if any of the things that I've talked about, in your opinion, merit a Decadent Book Club episode. Is there any kind of topic or genre or author or specific title that you want to delve into? I think there's a few ones in this list. Maybe it's Belle Burden's memoir. Maybe it's, There Is No Antimemetics Division. Maybe it's something like more along the lines of a thematic reading like I've done, which is on the concept of American identity. That's something I've been talking a lot about on the channel and clearly been reading a lot about in the meantime. Or here's one. Is there a book that has risen to your awareness in the zeitgeist that you think I should read and we could potentially all read together as a crew? Let me know. As always, thank you so much for hanging out with me and indulging me as I just talk about books for about an hour. Hopefully I'll be able to get this up quickly and we will chat again soon, kittens.